Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with the strangely powerful, deeply humiliating life of the eunuch men who were cut down so kings could sleep well. From boys sold by their own families to survive the knife, to guarding thousands of royal concubines you could never touch, to becoming the empire's scapegoat whenever crops failed, your entire existence was a mix of privilege and mockery. If you enjoy wandering through these darker corners of history with me, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if it feels right, and tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. So, settle in, maybe dim the lights, pour yourself a cup of tea, let the room grow quiet, and let's step gently into the world of those who were both indispensable and despised eunuchs in ancient courts. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Imagine waking up one morning in a dusty village in Ming China, or maybe under the purple dome of Byzantium, only to discover your parents have just sold your future, along with a few other things you might have preferred to keep. Not your cow, not your sandals. You, specifically, the parts of you that made you a man. Because congratulations, you're about to become a eunuch. Now, don't picture a sterile operating room with gloves, lights, and anesthesia. No, picture instead a dim back room with a bucket of tepid water, a sharp knife that looks more like it's been used on goats than people, and a man who calls himself a specialist but whose actual qualifications include, "I've done this before, twice, and the patient lived once." The procedure brutally simple, sometimes just the testicles went, more often the entire package. In China, the phrase "cutting the root" wasn't poetic, it was literal. The success rate, let's just say infection and death, were very competitive candidates for the job you didn't want in the first place. Families did this for reasons that, at the time, sounded logical. Selling a son into eunuchhood meant access to the palace, and access to the palace meant maybe, just maybe, a trickle of wealth or influence would flow back home. It was like buying a lottery ticket, except the ticket screamed in agony and occasionally bled to death. And you weren't asked, you were told. Because in a society where sons were assets, you were just one more investment, shaved clean and stitched up for someone else's future. And if you survived big, if you didn't simply heal, the body remembered. Your voice often rose in pitch, marking you in every conversation. Your body shifted. Eunuchs were described as softer, fleshier, sometimes growing obese, sometimes frail, all depending on how young the knife found you. And society never let you forget it. Your body was the receipt, stamped forever, proof that you'd been modified to fit the palace. But here's the cruelest irony. The very act that made you safe, unable to father children, unable to establish a dynasty, was also what locked you into suspicion and ridicule for the rest of your life. Everyone knew you'd been broken to serve, trimmed to fit neatly into a court that distrusted everyone anyway. The humiliation wasn't private, it was your defining feature. And yet, once the blood dried and the fever passed, your life didn't slow down. Because if you thought surviving the operation was the worst part, you were in for a long education. You weren't just cut, you were drafted into a system that measured your worth in loyalty, obedience, and the fact you couldn't impregnate anyone important. Your new title wasn't son, or boy, or man, it was eunuch, a category all its own, half trusted, half reviled, but always, always useful. And so, your story didn't end with a knife, that was just the beginning. Because now that you'd been reshaped, quite literally, for palace life, you had to live in the strange, suffocating role it carved for you. And the palace wasn't interested in who you used to be, it was only interested in what you could never be again. So, here you are, stitched, scarred, and technically alive. But survival doesn't mean freedom. What it really meant was that your body had just been converted into a political statement. You weren't just a man anymore. You were something else, something societies across centuries labeled as safe. Safe, of course, for the people in charge, not for you. See, in the Byzantine court, emperors loved eunuchs precisely because you couldn't father heirs. That meant you couldn't plant your own little dynasty in some dusty corner of the palace, and suddenly claim you had the bloodline to back it up. In China, 2 eunuchs were prized because they could be trusted to guard the imperial harem, hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women sequestered away from public view. The logic: if you couldn't reproduce, then you couldn't complicate the emperor's lineage. Your missing parts weren't seen as a tragedy. They were seen as the ultimate resume. But don't be fooled, being safe didn't mean being respected. In fact, it marked you as a walking contradiction, close enough to power to breathe its incense, but permanently excluded from ever wielding it in your own right. Aristocrats sneered at you, officials distrusted you, priests raised their eyebrows and muttered about unnatural bodies. And yet, in the palace, your strange mutilation was a badge of utility. You were indispensable precisely because you were disqualified from everything that normally gave men status: family, heirs, virility. Think about that. Your body was both your prison sentence and your security clearance. You could walk freely through women's quarters where no other man dared tread. But everyone knew it was because you'd been neutered like a house pet. You could serve emperors as chamberlains, treasurers, or spies. But the entire system whispered the same refrain: you were trustworthy only because you'd been broken. And the irony ran deep. You weren't seen as a man anymore, but you weren't a woman either. You occupied a third category, liminal, ambiguous. In Chinese records, eunuchs were sometimes referred to as neither male nor female, a permanent reminder that your identity had been stripped down to a role, not a person. You weren't your own. You were the state's tool, a body repurposed for palace logistics. And yet, emperors leaned on you constantly. Without heirs of your own, you had no family interests to promote, no dynasty to build, no children to inherit your offices. That, in theory, made you perfectly loyal, your entire fortune tied directly to whoever sat on the throne. But loyalty is never that simple, is it? The same condition that made you safe also made you easy to discard. You could be elevated overnight, trusted with the emperor's seal, and just as quickly blamed for corruption, stripped of everything, and executed. So, every time you bowed, every time you carried a message through the marbled halls of the palace, your very existence spoke a double message. Here stands a man who cannot betray us with heirs, and here kneels a man who can never truly belong. You weren't a symbol of stability. You were a symbol of calculated powerlessness. And if you thought that meant a quiet life of servitude, think again. Because powerlessness inside a palace wasn't comet, was suffocating. And the walls you served within weren't built for comfort. They were built to remind you every day that your body was no longer yours. By now, you've noticed something. Your body doesn't belong to you, and, inconveniently, neither does your life. Once you've been admitted to the palace, you're no longer a villager's son, no longer a free-floating person in society. Your palace property, as neatly categorized as a scroll, a chest of silk, or a particularly obedient horse. In Ming China, eunuchs were literally registered like items in the imperial household. Their names were written down, their origins noted, their roles assigned. You didn't have neighbors anymore, you had overseers. In Byzantium, eunuchs lived in separate wings, cut off from soldiers and courtiers, segregated like rare livestock. And make no mistake, you weren't pampered. You weren't a royal guest. You were state-owned, state-fed, state-disciplined. Your quarters, humble. You lived in dormitories with other eunuchs, rows of beds, no privacy, no personal family mementos because you weren't supposed to have family anymore. The palace became your household, the emperor your father, the harem your siblings, and the entire machinery of empire your suffocating extended family reunion. Except you couldn't leave early, and your movements controlled. You didn't stroll in and out of the palace like a nobleman visiting his estates. You belonged to the inner sanctum. Step outside without permission, and you risked punishment. Many courts banned eunuchs from even leaving palace grounds without authorization. You weren't trusted with freedom of movement, because freedom implied you might start imagining you were more than property. Every task you performed carried that same reminder. Whether you were carrying messages, guarding doors, or managing storerooms, you weren't an independent servant. You were the palace's mouth and hands, extensions of its will. And your salary, when you had one, was less payment for service and more upkeep for an asset. Feed the ox, oil the chariot, clothe the eunuch. What about personal identity? Forget it. You were rarely remembered as an individual unless you rose to scandalous heights of power. Otherwise, you were just one of them. In chronicles, eunuchs often appear as an anonymous, collective, faceless, voiceless, lumped together as if individuality itself had been cut away along with everything else. And the most stifling part, you couldn't build a world of your own. No wife, no children, no heirs to inherit your belongings or even remember your name. When you died, the palace absorbed what little you had left. Your body had been claimed in life, and your possessions followed it into death. So yes, you breathed the perfumed air of the inner court. You stood closer to emperors and queens than most nobles ever dreamed. But don't mistake proximity for freedom. You weren't there as a participant in power. You were there as part of the furniture indispensable, yes, but only as long as you remembered you were never your own. And if you thought being palace property meant a quiet existence of carrying trays and sweeping marble floors, well, that's not how courts work. Property has to serve, and in your case, it served in the most intimate, suffocating, and dangerous corners of royal life, which is exactly where your next role began. So now you've been absorbed into palace life, stamped and catalogued like a piece of expensive furniture. But not just any furniture, you're the kind that gets shoved into the most private, dangerous corner of the building, the harem. Yes, the very space that defined dynasties, whispered scandals, and could topple thrones before breakfast. And who better to guard it than you, a man with the evidence of manhood, forcibly edited out. This was the eunuch's infamous role across empires. In the forbidden city of Beijing, eunuchs controlled the emperor's harem of concubines, a sprawling population of women whose wombs determined succession. In the Ottoman Topkapi Palace, they guarded the sultan's wives, mothers, and favorites, known as the harem akalara, black eunuchs imported through brutal trade routes. In Byzantium, they held similar positions, keepers of empresses and princesses, eyes and ears within the purple chambers. The logic was painfully clear. No virility meant no threat, no risk of illegitimate children, no rival dynasties sprouting from late-night palace accidents. You were the state's insurance policy, the lock on the door, the human guarantee of female chastity. You weren't there because they trusted you. You were there because they didn't. But let's not romanticize it. Guarding the inner chambers wasn't lounging around silk curtains fanning royal women. It was surveillance. You managed rosters, checked visitors, memorized who entered and who left, and made sure rumors of impropriety died before they could breathe. In practice, you became both gatekeeper and jailer. The harem wasn't a paradise, it was a gilded prison. And you were the prison guard. And don't imagine the women adored you for it. Some despised eunuchs for being the ever-present obstacle between them and freedom. Others used you, slipping you bribes, favors, whispered promises of protection, because in that closed world, your word carried terrifying weight. A eunuch could whisper to the emperor that a concubine was unfaithful, and her life might end before morning. You wielded influence, yes, but influence that burned your hands every time you touched it. The eerie part. You saw everything. The tears, the schemes, the rivalries. The harem wasn't just about beauty. It was a battlefield of mothers trying to secure their sons as heirs, of favorites battling for knights with the emperor, of alliances sealed not with armies but with perfumes and silks. And in the middle of it, all your silent presence, watching, reporting, ensuring that no desire ever disrupted the fragile architecture of dynastic legitimacy. The irony couldn't be sharper. The same body that had been declared powerless now controlled the most powerful space in the empire, the wombs that would determine succession. You weren't just guarding women, you were guarding the very continuity of kingship. But that didn't make you a king. It made you a tool, one that could be discarded the moment you whispered to the wrong ear. So you kept your face blank, your voice soft, your footsteps silent on the marble floors. You lived among curtains, whispers, and incense, but never as a participant, always as the shadow that kept others in line. And if you thought being gatekeeper to the empire's most private quarters gave you real protection, well, palace life had other plans. Because guarding the chambers wasn't the end of your body's story. It was the beginning of a lifetime of scars that didn't always show on the skin. You might think the worst was over once the knife was put away, the fever subsided, and you'd managed to walk upright again. But bodies don't simply forget what's been done to them. Castration wasn't a one-time event. It was a lifetime sentence written into your bones, your flesh, and the way people stared at you. For starters, hormones are stubborn little things. Strip them away, and your body reacts in peculiar ways. Many eunuchs developed soft, rounded features. Without testosterone, muscle mass was harder to keep, fat easier to gain. Ancient records describe eunuchs as fleshy or soft-bodied, their figures reshaped by imbalance. Others grew tall and lanky, their limbs oddly elongated if the procedure was done young. Because growth plates never closed properly, you didn't just lose manhood, you lost the biological script your body had been following, and bones, brittle, Modern studies on skeletons from imperial China confirm what chroniclers hinted at. Osteoporosis was common. The same imbalance that softened your features quietly hollowed out your bones, leaving you prone to fractures. Imagine tripping on a palace stair and breaking a hip before you're 40. Nothing screamed divine servant, like hobbling down a marble hallway in pain while priests muttered about cosmic balance. Then there were the less visible torments. Urinary problems haunted eunuchs, especially those who'd endured the full removal. Infections, strictures, constant discomfort. A bladder that refused to cooperate during long ceremonies wasn't just humiliating, it was dangerous. Weakness could be interpreted as corruption, illness as divine punishment. You weren't allowed to be fragile. You were supposed to be the perfect, obedient instrument of the palace. And let's not forget the voice. High-pitched, nasal, instantly recognizable. You could try to keep your head down, to melt into anonymity, but your speech betrayed you every time you opened your mouth. Some mocked you as effeminate, others as ghostly, uncanny. Either way, your body kept announcing to the world what had been taken from you. It's almost darkly comic, isn't it? The very act meant to make you useful also made you vulnerable. The palace wanted guardians who couldn't father children. But what it got instead were fragile, conspicuous figures whose health could unravel at any moment. And when it did, the palace never accepted responsibility. It was your body's failure, not the knife's legacy. So you carried these scars quietly, learning to navigate the physical toll while pretending everything was fine. Because if you dared to show weakness, if you limped or coughed too much, someone might decide you were no longer fit for service. And being dismissed from the palace didn't mean freedom. It meant exile, poverty, maybe even death. And if you thought physical pain was enough, palace politics layered on another form of suffering, the subtle dance of trust and suspicion that would haunt every step you took. Here's the strangest paradox of your new life. You were trusted more than anyone else in the palace, and hated more than anyone else outside it. Eunuchs occupied this bizarre middle ground, like human lightning rods for suspicion and resentment. The emperor trusted you because you couldn't build a family dynasty. Ministers hated you because you weren't one of them. And the people, they whispered your name as a curse whenever the harvest failed. In Ming China, eunuchs were the emperor's private agents. You managed documents, treasury vaults, even espionage networks. To the emperor, this made you loyal. After all, what else did you have? But the scholar officials of the Confucian bureaucracy saw you as parasitesmen without virtue, clawing at influence with no ancestral tablets to keep them accountable. Corruption and eunuch became almost interchangeable words in the imperial record. Convenient, isn't it? If something went wrong, blame the eunuchs. In Byzantium, it was the same game with a different accent. Eunuchs held high court positions, sometimes commanding armies or handling imperial finances. Their loyalty to the emperor was real, but aristocrats and generals fumed at their influence. Effeminate, they sneered, as these supposedly weak men outmaneuvered them politically and even militarily. Narses, the 6th century Byzantine eunuch general, famously defeated the Goths in Italy, while noblemen back in Constantinople grumbled that a half-man had just done what they couldn't. And in the Ottoman Empire, black eunuchs, taken from Africa and brought to Istanbul, became the gatekeepers of the harem. To the Sultan, they were indispensable. To everyone else, they were a living reminder of how power could be entrusted to outsiders and slaves, rather than Ottoman nobles. They became easy scapegoats, powerful enough to envy, despised enough to target. So you walked a razor's edge every day, too close to the emperor, and you were accused of corruption. Too distant, and you were irrelevant. Too powerful, and you'd be purged when enemies rallied. Too weak, and you'd be forgotten until you starved. Every smile you gave, every order you carried, every whispered word could be interpreted as plotting. The irony. You were hated not because you had power, but because you had power without a family tree. Aristocrats could always explain their influence land, bloodlines, armies. You had nothing but proximity. And proximity to the throne was the one currency that turned envy into rage. So you perfected a kind of mask. Polite, deferential, never too assertive, never too meek. You learned to flatter without fawning, to advise without overstepping, to disappear when the knives were out and reappear when the dust settled. Survival meant becoming a mirror reflecting whatever the emperor wanted to see, while never showing the terror that sat in your chest. But masks are heavy things. And if suspicion was a constant shadow, the myth of unlimited power would soon be the spotlight burning on your face. If you read the chronicles, you'd think eunuchs ran entire empires. Scroll after scroll describes them as puppet masters, schemers, the shadowy hands pulling strings behind the throne. And sometimes, yes, a few of you did climb high enough to terrify the court. But let's not romanticize it. Most eunuchs didn't sit in smoky chambers plotting dynasties. They were more likely cleaning up incense ash in temples than controlling kings. Take Ming China. The name Wei Zhongxian still echoes in history as the eunuch who practically ruled during the Qianqi emperor's reign. He built temples in his honor, punished rivals, and staged purges that sent bureaucrats scrambling. But he was an exception, not the rule. For every Wei Zhongxian there were thousands of eunuchs fetching robes, scrubbing courtyards, or delivering orders they barely understood. Power was rare, unstable, and often fatal. Byzantium tells the same story. Narcissus may have commanded armies and negotiated with kings, but most eunuchs weren't out leading troops across Italy. They were chamberlains, treasurers, singers in the imperial choir rolls of proximity, not domination. And even the powerful ones walked on glass. Influence could vanish overnight if a new emperor decided you smelled too much like the old regime. And the Ottomans, the chief black eunuch of the harem, wielded enormous authority, guarding royal women and managing palace secrets. But for every powerful Akosk, countless others were little more than silent shadows in corridors, watching doors instead of shaping policy. The myth of eunuch power was useful propaganda. It explained palace corruption without blaming the emperor. Easier to accuse the unnatural servants than admit the ruler's own failures. So here's the cruel truth. Your power wasn't really power. It was borrowed light, shining only as long as the emperor pointed the torch your way. Step out of favor, and the very influence that made you feared became the noose around your neck. Courts loved to elevate eunuchs when it suited them, then execute them spectacularly when the political winds shifted. And yet, the myth stuck. Outsiders believed eunuchs whispered in emperors' ears, shaped dynasties, toppled kingdoms. Inside the palace, you knew better. Influence was fleeting, unstable, and dangerous. It wasn't power, it was a trap disguised as it. And every trap has a ceiling, because no matter how high you rose, there was a line you could never cross. The throne was never yours. The dynasty was never yours. The family tree stopped at your name, with no branches, no descendants, and that ceiling pressed down harder the higher you climbed. Which brings us to the next reality of your life. The strange, suffocating career ladder you were allowed to climb, and the cruel joke waiting at the top. So let's talk about your career. Yes, you had one. Don't imagine eunuchs as silent wall ornaments. Courts loved hierarchy, and eunuchs fit neatly into it. You could start out as a lowly errand runner polishing floors, lighting lamps, delivering scrolls. If you were clever, discreet, and just obsequious enough, you might climb into positions of trust, supervising storerooms, managing treasuries, even handling the emperor's private seal. Some eunuchs became indispensable administrators, the human gears inside the great machinery of empire. But here's the catch: you could climb the ladder, but there was no top rung. You could accumulate wealth, titles, influence, but you'd never pass it on. No sons to inherit your estate, no family dynasty to protect your name. Whatever you built, the palace absorbed when you died. A life's work turned into someone else's ledger entry, your legacy. At best, a footnote in a court chronicle, usually with corrupt scribbled next to it for good measure. That didn't stop you from trying. Of course, eunuchs learned to play the court game with sharp precision. You cultivated allies among concubines, whispered advice into the emperor's ear, traded favors with generals, bribed scribes. You learned to thrive in the gray zones, where family men couldn't always maneuver. After all, a eunuch with no heirs had nothing to lose. But that also meant you had no shield. Every intrigue you joined was personal. Every risk you took fell squarely on your head, and the paranoia constant. One day you were indispensable, the next you were accused of treason. Chinese dynasties repeatedly purged entire eunuch factions, executing thousands in waves of bloodletting that reset the palace balance. In Byzantium, fallen eunuchs were blinded, exiled, or quietly removed from office. In the Ottoman court, losing favor could mean a one-way trip down the Bosphorus in a weighted sack. Careers weren't measured in years, they were measured in how long you could survive someone else's suspicion. the bitterest irony. The higher you climbed, the more precarious it became. The closer you got to the emperor, the more dangerous every step was. A forgotten scroll, a misplaced whisper, one ill-timed glance of it could collapse your career overnight. And since you had no family dynasty to absorb the blow, it was always your neck, your fortune, your name. So you lived in this strange duality, powerful enough to influence kings, powerless to ever secure your own bloodline. You could orchestrate the future of an empire, but not your own. That's the ceiling, not glassstone, cold, heavy, unbreakable. And yet, somehow, the world outside the palace thought you were thriving. They mocked you as greedy, ambitious, corrupt. They turned your life into a running joke, as if humiliation was part of your salary. Which, conveniently, brings us to your next daily misery, being reduced to entertainment. If you thought your fragile body and precarious career weren't enough, society had one more gift for you: ridicule. Being a eunuch didn't just mean serving the palace, it meant serving as a punchline. You weren't simply marginalized. You were mocked, caricatured, written into plays and stories as the embodiment of corruption, greed, and effeminacy. Your body was already a public spectacle, and culture made sure it stayed that way. In Byzantium, satirists loved to sneer at eunuchs' high-pitched voices. The sound alone marked you as something unnatural, the court jester's easy material. Eunuchs were painted as sly, conniving, half-men who lurked in shadows, anxious whispers behind purple curtains. The joke wasn't that you were powerful. The joke was that you were pathetic, and yet somehow still pulling the strings. A contradiction too delicious for chroniclers to ignore. Chinese literature was no kinder. Eunuchs were stereotyped as greedy, corrupt, manipulative, the perfect scapegoat for palace failings. If a dynasty struggled, blame the eunuchs. If an emperor fell under suspicion, blame the eunuchs. Entire plays were staged where eunuchs were the villain, the schemer, the grotesque foil for upright Confucian officials. The audience laughed, hissed, nodded, and somewhere, real eunuchs heard their lives turned into comedy. Even the Ottomans, whose black eunuchs guarded the most powerful women in the empire, weren't spared cultural disdain. Eunuchs were ridiculed as sinister go-betweens, soft-bodied tricksters hovering at the edges of power. You might have stood in the shadow of the sultan's harem, but in popular imagination, you were a figure of mockery. The butt of whispered jokes in the bazaar, the cruel part. You couldn't escape it. Your voice, your body, your entire existence advertised what had been done to you. You couldn't blend into anonymity, couldn't pass as a normal man outside palace walls. You were always marked, always visible, always subject to gears. Your very identity was a spectacle. And yet, behind that mockery was a strange kind of fear. People laughed at you precisely because they worried about your proximity to power. Jokes turned you into caricatures, so they didn't have to face the truth that eunuchs could be dangerous because they weren't bound by the same rules of family and inheritance. Laughter was a weapon to strip you of dignity and make your influence seem absurd. But ridicule has a way of sinking into the skin. Over time, you learned to laugh at yourself in public while gritting your teeth in private. You wore the mask of the harmless servant while enduring whispers of half-men behind your back. Your humiliation wasn't an accident, it was policy, baked into culture, scripted into plays, etched into chronicles. And if mockery wasn't enough, religion piled on another layer of unease. Because while society laughed at you, the theologians were debating whether you even had a place in the moral order. Now, let's add religion into the mix, because nothing lightens the burden of a mutilated body like centuries of theologians arguing over whether you should even exist. The truth is, eunuchs lived at the awkward crossroads between doctrine and necessity. And depending on where you were born, you might be considered holy, cursed, or just inconvenient. Take Christianity. The Bible isn't silent on the matter. There's that famous line in Matthew about those who made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, which early interpreters sometimes stretched into a backhanded compliment. On the other hand, church councils routinely frowned on castration, calling it mutilation, a violation of divine order. So you were caught in the contradiction. The emperor relied on you, but the priests muttered that your very body was an offense against God. In Byzantium, this contradiction was sharp. Eunuchs couldn't marry, which the church saw as unnatural, but they could rise to high positions within the clergy itself, bishops, abbots, even patriarchs. The argument: since you had no heirs, you couldn't be tempted by family ambitions, you were perfect for celibacy. Your mutilation repurposed as a form of spiritual discipline. Convenient theology at its finest. Condemn the knife, then use its product, Islamic law. Meanwhile, condemned castration outright. The Prophet Muhammad is recorded as forbidding it, stressing that mutilation of the body was against divine creation. And yet, the Ottoman Empire employed thousands of eunuchs in its palace. The work around don't perform the operation yourself. Import eunuchs from elsewhere, Africa, Persia, the Caucasus, and then claim your hands were clean. Technically, the sin was outsourced, morality satisfied, loophole exploited. And in Confucian China, officially, castration was a disgrace to filial piety. Your body was a gift from your parents. Mutilating it dishonored the family line. Yet emperors surrounded themselves with eunuchs, treating them as indispensable. Once again, principle buckled under politics. Scholars denounced eunuchs as corrupt and unvirtuous, while emperors handed them the keys to the empire. So, you see the pattern. Religions recoiled at your existence, but rulers clung to you like a bad habit they couldn't quit. You became the theological exception, the necessary evil. The sin everyone agreed to overlook, because palaces couldn't function without you. But living under that tension wasn't peaceful. It meant priests could sneer at you as unnatural, while simultaneously promoting you to high office. It meant imams condemned the act that made you, while sultans expanded your duties. It meant Confucian officials spat on you as morally degenerate, while emperors sent you to oversee entire provinces. You weren't just torn physically, you were torn spiritually, a body caught between divine order and political necessity. And if you thought being called unnatural by theologians while being indispensable to rulers didn't mess with your sense of belonging, wait until you realize that, outside palace walls, you weren't even considered part of ordinary society. Step outside the palace walls for a moment. If you even could stand, you'd quickly notice something. You didn't belong. Not to the aristocracy, not to the clergy, not even to the ordinary people buying figs in the market. You were a permanent outsider, defined less by what you did than by what you lacked. In China, Confucian scholars saw you as a threat to moral order. You weren't a man, because men produced heirs to honor ancestors. You weren't a woman, because women's virtue was tied to fertility. So where did that leave you? Nowhere. You occupied a blank space on society's chart, a walking question mark in silk robes. Byzantium treated you the same way. Eunuchs might climb into high court or church positions, but outside those marble halls they were considered peculiar, ambiguous, even eerie. Chroniclers described them as neither male nor female, a category that invited fascination and disgust in equal measure. People feared your proximity to power, but they wouldn't invite you to their dinner tables. And the Ottomans, black eunuchs imported through the slave trade, faced double alienation. Not only castrated, but often foreign, ripped from homelands in Sudan or Ethiopia, and thrust into a palace that valued them only for their absence of lineage. Outsiders twice over racially and bodily, they formed tight-knit communities within Topkapi Palace, but beyond its gates, they were strangers in a city that never really claimed them. What did this mean for your daily life? Isolation. Eunuchs often lived together in their own quarters, forming a subculture of half-brothers who shared nothing but scars. In China, retired eunuchs sometimes sought refuge in Buddhist monasteries, finding in monastic life a rare place where celibacy was not only tolerated, but honored. In Byzantium, some withdrew into estates, granted by the state, living out their lives on the margins, half forgotten, and then there was death. Without heirs, who remembered you? Ordinary men lived on through sons reciting ancestral prayers. You left no bloodline, no lineage to carry your name. Whatever belongings you managed to accumulate, silks, gold, books, were absorbed back into the palace, or snatched by opportunists. You were a shadow in life, and a footnote in death. The cruelest part, the palace depended on you, yet society never fully accepted you. You could manage the emperor's treasury, advise on state policy, guard the future heirs of an empire, and still be looked at as something less than human. Useful, yes. Indispensable, often. Belonging, never. And being permanently outside came with another cost. You became the perfect tool of control. If you couldn't anchor yourself in family or society, then the palace made sure to anchor you to its service, body and soul. Here's the thing about being an outsider. It made you the perfect insider. Your very detachment from family and society turned you into the palace's favorite instrument of control. Emperors and sultans didn't just keep you around for guarding doors or polishing jewels. They used you as their eyes, ears, and occasionally, their clenched fist. Take Ming China again. Eunuchs weren't just chamberlains. They ran espionage networks. They delivered imperial orders, often with the authority to punish or reward on the spot. Imagine being handed a scroll and told, "Take this to the governor, and by the way, if he resists, feel free to execute him." You weren't a soldier, but your voice carried the emperor's weight. Governors bowed to you not because of who you were, but because of who you represented. In Byzantium, eunuchs controlled access to the emperor. You literally held the doors, deciding who got an audience and who waited in the marble corridors for hours. In a court where proximity equaled influence, being the gatekeeper was almost as powerful as being the emperor himself. Ministers cursed you under their breath, but also bribed you to whisper their names into imperial ears. You didn't need land or armies, you had keys, and keys can strangle more efficiently than chains. And in the Ottoman Empire, the chief black eunuch wasn't just guarding the harem. He oversaw the education of princes, managed palace finances, and carried messages between the sultan and the outside world. Every word you spoke shaped perception. Every pause, every inflection of your high-pitched voice could tilt policy, ruin reputations, or seal someone's fate. But let's not glamorize it. Being an instrument of control didn't mean you were in control. You were still a tool, wielded by the throne. If the emperor wanted to intimidate his ministers, he sent you. If he wanted to spy on his generals, he sent you. If he wanted to crush dissent, he sent you. You didn't decide the direction, you delivered it. And when people resented the blows, they resented you, not the hand that swung you. That's the double bind. The more power you exercised, the more hatred you attracted. If you played the role too faithfully, you became the embodiment of tyranny. If you hesitated, you looked disloyal. Either way, you ended up on someone's list. And in palace politics, lists often ended with exile, execution, or a weighted bag in the river. So you perfected discretion. You learned how to terrify without speaking loudly, how to spy without being seen, how to deliver the emperor's cruelty with a polite bow. You became the human extension of despotism, useful precisely because you had no personal stake, no family ties to soften your hand. And yet, while the palace used your body as bureaucracy, the rest of society never forgot what you were. Your very existence blurred lines, unsettled categories. You weren't just a tool, you were living proof that power could flow through mutilation. Which meant the next role you played was even stranger. You became the embodiment of bureaucracy itself. A body turned into paperwork. If you ever wanted to know what it feels like to become paperwork, being a eunuch gave you the answer. You weren't just a person anymore, you were bureaucracy incarnate. Your body, your very absence of heirs, made you the perfect filing cabinet for the state. Think about it. In China, emperors used eunuchs as treasury officials and warehouse keepers, because you couldn't pass wealth to your sons. Whatever you accumulated, gold, grain, silk, ultimately flowed back to the state. You were a vault without a key, a ledger without a margin for family interests. Perfect for empire, tragic for you. In Byzantium, eunuchs filled civil offices where loyalty was essential, but inheritance was dangerous. They managed court ceremonies, diplomatic missions, financial ledgers, all the invisible gears that kept the empire creaking forward. Their neutrality wasn't a choice. It was carved into their skin. No family to promote, no dynasty to secure, no cousin to sneak into a cushy job. You were impartial because you'd been forcibly edited into impartiality. And in the Ottoman palace, black eunuchs oversaw educational systems for princes, tax registers, the harem economy. You weren't just recording bureaucracy, you were bureaucracy. An emperor didn't need to trust paper when he could trust a body that had no family tree, no rival claims, no inheritance drama. It sounds efficient, doesn't it? Strip a man of lineage, and you strip him of ambition, leaving behind pure service. But of course, reality was messier. Eunuchs found ways to amass fortunes, build patronage networks, even construct legacies through temples, charities, or adopted heirs. After all, bureaucracy leaks. Even bodies, designed to be neutral, learned to play the game. And when they did, entire empires convulsed with anger at the corrupt eunuchs who dared to turn paperwork into power. And here's the irony. By turning you into a bureaucratic tool, the palace also made you the perfect scapegoat. If corruption spread, blame the eunuchs. If taxes vanished, blame the eunuchs. If the grain store emptied, blame the eunuchs. You were the human equivalent of the other column in an accounting ledger. Everything inconvenient got dumped into you. But scapegoats rarely live long. And in courts that thrived on paranoia, that meant your life was always dangling over the pit. Because one day, the same ruler who relied on your loyalty might decide that you, not the ministers, not the generals, not the dynasty, were the problem. And when that day came, the bureaucracy you embodied turned on you like a paper guillotine. Which brings us to the next reality of palace life. The sudden terrifying reversals of fortune that defined every eunuch's career. Here's the part they don't print on the recruitment posters for palace life. No matter how high you climbed, no matter how indispensable you became, your entire world could collapse in an instant. One bad omen, one suspicious rumor, one new ruler and, suddenly, your name was on the wrong side of history. China was merciless about this. Eunuchs might hold the emperor's seal one day and face execution squads the next. Entire factions were purged in great sweeps, their bodies piled in courtyards, their estates confiscated, their names condemned in stone. The Ming dynasty alone staged multiple bloodbaths, where thousands of eunuchs were slaughtered to purify the court. Loyalty didn't save you, it only made your downfall more dramatic. Byzantium had its own repertoire of reversals. Eunuchs were blinded to ensure they could never rule, exiled to remote monasteries, or quietly strangled in the palace's shadowy corners. The same high voice that once delivered imperial commands could, overnight, be silenced with a rope. And because you had no heirs, your disgrace died with no sons to avenge you, no dynasty to rewrite your story. The Ottomans weren't gentler. Black eunuchs at Topkapi might rise to extraordinary authority, but fall from grace was brutal. Some were dismissed to obscurity, others drowned in the Bosphorus, their bodies swallowed by the same waters that had carried them to Istanbul in chains. The palace treated you like furniture, useful while polished, disposable once chipped. The cruelest irony was that reversals weren't always tied to failure. Sometimes they happened because you were too successful, too wealthy, too close to the ruler, too central in palace intrigue. You became a target not because you stumbled, but because you stood too firmly, and courts, by nature, could not tolerate stability. Someone had to be sacrificed to keep the game moving. So you lived every day in the shadow of reversal. You kept your possessions light, your friendships shallow, your ambitions cloaked. You learned to accept that every bow you received, every bribe slipped into your hand, every favor whispered into your ear might be the same gesture that got you killed tomorrow. It wasn't paranoia, it was policy. You weren't just serving in a court, you were surviving in a machine designed to chew through bodies like yours, then spit out the bones as a warning to the next generation. And if all this sounds unbearable, remember, you endured it because you had no choice. Your body had been claimed, your role assigned, your destiny sealed. The palace didn't just own your flesh, it owned your future. Which leads us to the final and cruelest irony, the way your very body was used to symbolize the bureaucracy of empire. And the way history remembered you not as a man, but as a cautionary tale. So after the knife, the palace, the humiliation, the suspicion, and the endless reversals, what was left of you? A paradox. You were indispensable to empires, yet despised by the very societies that relied on you. You whispered in emperors' ears, but left no sons to whisper your name. You kept dynasties alive, but carried none of your own. The final irony of being a eunuch was this. Your entire existence was for others. Your body was mutilated so kings could sleep soundly. Your service ensured dynasties could parade their legitimacy. Your loyalty was praised until it became dangerous. And when you died, the palace swept up your belongings. Historians scribbled corrupt next to your name, and life went on without a pause. In China, the Confucian record books immortalized eunuchs as villains of dynastic decline, their names invoked whenever emperors lost control. In Byzantium, you linger in chronicles as eerie figures, half men, half ghosts, strangely powerful and strangely pitied. In the Ottoman Empire, you lived as guardians of the Sultan's harem, only to vanish into obscurity once you were no longer useful. Across cultures, your story ends the same way, used, blamed, erased. And yet, without you, empires wouldn't have functioned. Who else would guard the harems, manage the treasuries, run the secret intelligence, enforce the emperor's will? You were the gears inside the machine, essential but invisible, always spinning, never celebrated. History remembers you with suspicion and contempt, but not with gratitude. The world laughed at your body, feared your influence, and then conveniently forgot you. Except in one sense you became a symbol, not of loyalty or service, but of how power uses and discards the vulnerable. That's the final cruelty. You lived a life of ritual, service, and pain, and your reward was to be remembered as the villain of someone else's story. A walking reminder that sometimes the people closest to power are also the ones most stripped of it. And maybe, if you listen closely, that's the faintest echo that lingers, the sound of a high-pitched voice in a marble corridor, forever blamed, forever necessary, forever outside the family of man. Castration wasn't an accident of history. It wasn't the odd cruelty of one eccentric ruler. It was policy, calculated and deliberate, woven into the political machinery of some of the greatest empires on earth. When dynasties needed men they could trust completely and feared everyone with a family name, they turned to the knife. In imperial China, families desperate for survival sometimes sold their sons to state officials who promised palace employment. The price of admission was flesh. The operation was crude, done with knives better suited for livestock than children. Mortality rates soared. Infection, fever, and shock killed many before they ever saw a palace gate. But the survivors were carried into a new category of existence. They were no longer sons of farmers or villagers. They became state property, reshaped by surgery into instruments of loyalty. Byzantium followed its own version of the practice. Boys were cut and trained for service at court, their mutilation serving as the ultimate proof that they could never found dynasties of their own. The body became a credential, the absence of heirs a guarantee. It was an identity forged, not in birthright but in amputation. The Ottomans perfected the system on a massive scale. Enslaved boys from Africa and the Caucasus were castrated before being marched to Istanbul. Their suffering rationalized as preparation for the palace. They would guard harems, serve sultans, and manage treasuries not as men in the ordinary sense, but as tools, stripped of the most basic avenues of personal ambition. It was never about the body alone. The knife was a political instrument. A eunuch was trustworthy because he had been rendered incapable of betrayal in the one way rulers feared most, creating a rival line. The very mutilation that disfigured him also certified him as loyal, a human guarantee that bloodlines would remain pure and dynasties unchallenged. But the wound didn't close when the bandages came off. It followed them everywhere, shaping their role, their perception, and the strange half-space they would occupy in court life. Their bodies became guarantees, their scars turned into contracts written in skin. And from that point on, the body itself was no longer theirs. It was a living pledge to the throne. And once the body had been turned into a guarantee, it didn't stop there. It became something even stranger, a symbol, carried like a banner, announcing to everyone that this person could never be more than a servant of the state. The altered body wasn't hidden. It was paraded as proof. Castration turned boys into visible guarantees of dynastic safety, living reminders that no rival heirs could ever come from their blood. In China, eunuchs could walk into the women's quarters without raising suspicion, their presence legitimized by absence. Their scar was their passport. The court saw them not as broken men, but as safeguards. In Byzantium, their voices gave them away, instantly high, nasal, impossible to disguise. That sound alone was enough to reassure emperors that no illegitimate children would crawl out of their palaces. The eunuch's body was a political insurance policy, a contract enforced not by paper or law but by flesh. In the Ottoman court, the chief black eunuch wielded enormous authority over the imperial harem. His position built entirely on the fact that his body could not contaminate the dynasty. He managed access to the sultan's women, organized education for princes, and carried secrets across palace walls. His influence measured by how thoroughly his mutilation neutralized suspicion. The irony was impossible to miss. What made them powerless in the world of family and legacy made them indispensable in the world of politics. A eunuch could stand closer to queens, concubines, and empresses than generals or nobles ever could. Their impotence became their authority, their disqualification the very source of their access. But a guarantee is not a person. The palace valued the condition, not the man. A eunuch's body was a seal of approval, stamped forever by absence, transformed into an emblem of obedience. He was useful precisely because he could never step outside the role, never turn usefulness into independence. The same scar that opened doors also locked them. And once inside those doors, usefulness had to be multiplied. Guarantees didn't sit idle. They were pushed into service, absorbed into the machinery of the palace, reshaped again not by knives this time, but by hierarchy and confinement. Once the body became a guarantee, the palace turned that guarantee into a system. Eunuchs weren't occasional figures wandering the marble corridors. They were entire institutions, manufactured in bulk, processed, and sorted like the empire's most peculiar resource. In China, the Forbidden City swelled with thousands of them. Some estimates during the Ming dynasty put their numbers above 70,000, a workforce so vast it formed its own miniature society inside the walls. Eunuchs cleaned, recorded, carried, guarded, sang, cooked, plotted, and died, an entire bureaucracy of men defined by what they no longer were. The palace didn't just accept eunuchs, it produced and consumed them on an industrial scale. Byzantium did the same on a smaller stage. Eunuchs filled every ceremonial role imaginable: chamberlains guiding visitors into the emperor's presence, keepers of the treasury, guardians of imperial relics. Their numbers were fewer than in Beijing, but their visibility was constant. From the moment a guest entered the palace, the first figure he met was not a general or a noble, but a eunuch, his voice betraying him before his words did. And in the Ottoman Empire, the top-copy palace depended on eunuchs so deeply that two parallel hierarchies evolved: white eunuchs, often from the Caucasus, handling administrative duties, and black eunuchs, often from Africa, managing the harem. Together they formed an indispensable web of control, moving silently between courtyards and chambers. They weren't ornaments, they were infrastructure. Segregated quarters reinforced this reality. Eunuchs lived in clusters, housed close to the spaces they served. The harem had its eunuchs, the treasury had its eunuchs, the rituals had their eunuchs. Each palace became a hive, and eunuchs were the worker bees, sterile, tireless, expendable. The logic was brutally efficient. A dynasty could not risk entrusting intimacy or secrecy to ordinary men. Families brought politics with them. Eunuchs brought nothing but scars. And so the palace became both employer and warden, a place where castrated boys were turned into political tools, refined, ranked, and deployed wherever rulers needed loyalty, unmarred by bloodline. But if palaces treated eunuchs as indispensable, they never forgot what had been taken. The body wasn't just reshaped, it was redefined. And with that redefinition came a strange new identity, a manufactured category hovering uneasily between manhood and servitude. The knife didn't just remove flesh, it rewrote identity. Eunuchs weren't considered men in the usual sense. They were carved into a third category, hovering between worlds, stripped of the rights and responsibilities tied to masculinity. And it was precisely this absence that rulers exploited. In China, Confucian ideals revolved around family filial piety, lineage, sons to honor ancestors. A eunuch had none of that. No fatherhood, no ancestral continuity, no shrine of descendants to keep his name alive. He was a dead end, a branch lopped off the family tree, which made him, paradoxically, perfect. Without lineage, his loyalty could be redirected entirely toward the emperor. His service wasn't divided by blood. His devotion was compulsory. Byzantium thought along the same lines. Eunuchs were barred from marriage and reproduction, and their absence of family ties made them seem incorruptible, at least controllable. They could rise in the church, in the palace, even in the military, precisely because their loyalty had no other outlet. In theory, a eunuch couldn't plot for his sons. He had no sons. He was bound to the emperor, as tightly as a chain around the throat. The Ottomans perfected the formula with chilling clarity. The Sultan's harem was entrusted to eunuchs, not only because they posed no sexual threat, but because they embodied loyalty manufactured through mutilation. Their bodies were proof of sacrifice. Their service was built on the assumption that everything they once might have desired was now gone. The harem was filled with women tied to dynastic succession. The eunuchs who guarded them had been stripped of any such claim. Masculinity wasn't just removed, it was weaponized in absence. Every reminder of what a eunuch lacked became a reminder of what made him safe. High-pitched voices, soft faces, rounded body features, mocked in society but cherished in palaces, because they screamed, "Here is someone who cannot betray through lineage." But the absence didn't tear us his suspicion. Loyalty manufactured through violence was never comfortable. Eunuchs might have been bound to rulers by scars, but to everyone else, those scars looked like proof of something unnatural, which meant that their very usefulness carried with it an unshakable shadow of mistrust. And that mistrust followed them everywhere, sharpening into envy and hatred as they drifted closer to the throne. Eunuchs lived closer to rulers than most generals or ministers ever dreamed. They dressed emperors, carried their secrets, guarded their wives, delivered their orders. Proximity was their currency, and in the architecture of power, proximity is everything. But proximity without lineage didn't inspire respect. It inspired suspicion. In China, eunuchs often eclipsed Confucian, scholar officials in influence. The scholars, who prided themselves on their family traditions and classical training, saw eunuchs as corrupt intruders, men without fathers or sons, meddling in affairs too lofty for them. The Confucian bureaucracy wrote history, and in their histories eunuchs became villains, blamed for dynastic decline, accused of whispering poison into emperors' ears. Byzantium sang the same tune. Eunuchs could rise as generals, diplomats, even patriarchs of the church. Yet noble families looked down on them as half-men who had no rightful place at the heart of empire. Their voices were mocked, their bodies ridiculed, their influence tolerated only as long as it suited the throne. A eunuch who won a battle was dangerous. A eunuch who lost one was disposable. Either way, suspicion never lifted. The Ottomans were no kinder. Black eunuchs at Topkapi Palace held immense sway over the Sultan's harem and, through it, the succession itself. But their power carried resentment. Turkish nobles seethed that foreigners, men mutilated and enslaved, could outrank them at court. When the palace faltered, the eunuchs became the scapegoats, accused of scheming, corruption, and betrayal. Suspicion was permanent because trust was manufactured. Eunuchs were trusted by rulers precisely because they had been broken. Everyone else read that same condition not as loyalty, but as menace. The scar that gave them access to the palace also marked them as dangerous intruders in every other circle. It was a precarious existence, never fully trusted, never fully accepted. One step too close to the throne, and you were accused of manipulation. One step too far, and you vanished into obscurity. Suspicion clung like incense smoke, following through every chamber, lingering long after words were spoken. And rulers, sensing this, sharpened that suspicion into usefulness. If eunuchs could not be trusted as equals, they could certainly be used as instruments of surveillance and control. The same suspicion that clung to eunuchs became their greatest function. If they couldn't be trusted as equals, they could be trusted as watchers. Rulers turned them into instruments of control, embedding them in the palace like silent wires carrying power from one chamber to the next. In Ming China, eunuchs served as imperial messengers, their words treated as if they came directly from the emperor's mouth. They delivered edicts, collected reports, even oversaw punishments. To governors and generals, a eunuch's arrival wasn't a visitit, was surveillance on legs. Behind the silk robes and high voices lurked the authority to end careers, sometimes lives. Byzantium placed eunuchs at thresholds. They controlled the doors to the emperor, deciding who entered and who waited. A single nod or delay could shift political fortunes, and everyone knew it. Ministers bribed them, generals flattered them, nobles gritted their teeth and begged for access. The eunuch became the lock and the key, the human barrier between ambition and the throne. The Ottoman palace relied on them even more visibly. The chief black eunuch not only guarded the harem, but also carried the Sultan's private orders, managed correspondence, and oversaw the prince's education. Every glance, every raised eyebrow, every pause before relaying a message could tilt policy. Behind his mutilated body stood the unspoken authority of the Sultan. Surveillance wasn't subtle. Eunuchs were eyes in the harem, ears in the treasury, hands in the archives. They spied on nobles, watched ministers, and reported back on the smallest deviations. Their loyalty was written into their bodies, and rulers exploited it fully. The eunuch's life became an endless act of observation, monitoring others while being monitored himself. But surveillance is a strange kind of intimacy. It brought eunuchs into rooms where trust was impossible, conversations where secrecy was fragile, rituals where mistakes carried cosmic weight. They were tools, sharpened not by skill but by mutilation, wielded as extensions of rulers who feared everyone else. And in this role, their bodies stopped being just scarred flesh. They became part of the bureaucracy itself, living documents that enforced loyalty through their very existence. At some point, the eunuch stopped being seen as a man at all, and started functioning like paperwork. His body was bureaucracy incarnate, an administrative tool, catalogued and deployed to keep the machinery of empire humming. In imperial China, eunuchs managed warehouses stacked with grain, silks, and weapons. They oversaw tax collection, guarded the emperor's seals, and handled archives. Their utility came from the absence of lineage. Unlike noble officials, they had no sons to smuggle into cushy posts, no nephews to enrich on the side. At least in theory, their mutilation made them impartial state clerks, sealed by scars. Byzantium treated them similarly. Eunuchs became treasurers, record keepers, masters of ceremonies. Their presence was supposed to guarantee neutrality. A eunuch couldn't hijack an office for his family because he had no family. He was a living safeguard against dynastic corruption, the empire's human firewall against nepotism. In the Ottoman court, bureaucracy leaned heavily on eunuchs. White eunuchs managed the palace school. Black eunuchs supervised the harem and oversaw correspondence. They didn't just handle documents, they became documents. A eunuch carrying the sultan's order was as binding as the written decree itself. His body certified its authenticity. But neutrality is never perfect. Eunuchs, though disqualified from bloodlines, built their own patronage networks. They adopted heirs, sponsored temples, hoarded wealth. The very system designed to prevent corruption bred new versions of it. Yet the myth of bureaucratic purity endured, because it was carved into their bodies. The palace kept telling itself, these men cannot betray us, because they cannot reproduce. And so their scarred flesh became a filing system, their voices signatures, their presence a rubber stamp of imperial authority. They weren't men with ambitions. They were tools designed to limit ambition in others. Still, even paperwork grows worn, creased, and mocked in the margins. The bureaucratic body, for all its neutrality, was also a body in pain, fragile, sickly, and constantly ridiculed for what it lacked. If the palace saw eunuchs as pure instruments of bureaucracy, their bodies stubbornly refused to cooperate. Castration wasn't just political, it was medical, and the scars lingered long after the operation was done. Their health bore the cost of loyalty, and society made sure the humiliation stuck. Without testosterone, bones weakened. Archaeological studies of eunuch skeletons in China reveal brittle frames, osteoporosis setting in decades earlier than in ordinary men. Some grew unusually tall. If the surgery was done young, their limbs stretched out by growth plates that never closed, while others grew heavy, soft-bodied, vulnerable to disease. The body told its own story of absence, every curve or fracture a reminder of what had been cut away. There were subtler torments too. Urinary problems plagued eunuchs who had endured full removal, infections festering quietly while ceremonies demanded long hours of stillness. Pain was constant, but weakness could never be shown. A trembling hand during ritual wasn't illness, it was interpreted as corruption, even heresy. And then there was the voice, high-pitched, nasal, impossible to hide. In crowded halls, a eunuch's speech betrayed him instantly. Chroniclers and playwrights seized on it, turning eunuchs into caricatures effeminate villains with shrill tones and scheming minds. Their bodies were mocked, their voices jeered at, their very existence reduced to a cruel theatre of derision. In Byzantium, satire targeted eunuchs mercilessly. They were lampooned as sly, deceitful, half-men who skulked in corridors. In China, Confucian scholars filled their histories with scorn, blaming eunuchs for dynastic collapse, corrupting emperors, and ruining governance. In the Ottoman Empire, whispers in the marketplace mocked the black eunuchs of Topkapi, portraying them as sinister shadows who meddled in affairs far above their station. Health made them fragile, humiliation made them visible, and together, fragility and mockery marked them as both indispensable and despised. They were indispensable because only they could serve in such intimate, dangerous roles. They were despised because their very bodies reminded everyone of mutilation, of weakness, of a political system propped up by scars. But humiliation alone didn't end their story. Power has a habit of turning the humiliated into scapegoats, and when courts shifted, when dynasties faltered, eunuchs weren't just mocked, they were purged. History loved nothing more than inflating eunuchs into villains when things went wrong. They could rise higher than anyone else without a family name, but their rise always painted a target on their backs. Palaces turned them into indispensable courtiers. Then dynasties scapegoated them when the balance of power tilted. Their lives moved in cycles: favor, suspicion, purge, repeat. In Ming China, the eunuch Wei Zhongxian practically ruled the empire during the 1620s. Temples were built in his honor. Ministers bowed at his feet. His name became synonymous with authority. And then the emperor died. Almost overnight, Wei was denounced, his statues destroyed, his followers executed. The man who had carried the empire's secrets ended his life, hanging in disgrace, his body tossed into the dirt. That was the rhythm, elevated as a savior, discarded as a parasite. Byzantium staged similar dramas. Eunuchs who had risen to command armies or negotiate treaties were paraded as loyal servants one year and blinded or exiled the next. Their influence was tolerated only while it served the emperor. A shift in dynasty, a whisper of treason, and the same voice that had announced imperial decrees was silenced permanently, usually with a cord round the throat. The Ottomans followed the same script. The chief black eunuch, who held enormous authority over the sultan's harem and correspondence, could accumulate wealth and respect far beyond many viziers, but power in Topkapi was slippery. Some eunuchs were drowned in the Bosphorus when their closeness to the throne became inconvenient. Others were quietly retired into obscurity, their fortunes confiscated, their names erased from the record. The cycle was predictable, almost mechanical. Eunuchs rose because rulers needed them. Eunuchs fell because rulers feared them. The very scar that marked them as loyal servants could be recast as the brand of corruption. When dynasties faltered, the knife that had cut them once returned metaphorically to finish the job. And the most cutting irony was that no matter how often the cycle repeated, palaces always replenished their ranks. For every eunuch purged, another was waiting in the wings, freshly scarred, ready to step into the same dangerous spotlight. The machine never stopped. It fed on bodies, chewed through lives, and produced the same story again and again. And at the end of that cycle, what remained was not glory, but emptiness. Eunuchs left no heirs, no line to remember them. Their power dissolved at death, absorbed back into the palace that had consumed their bodies from the beginning. Which leads to the final irony, the strange way history remembers them: indispensable in life, erased in memory. When the chronicles were written, eunuchs rarely emerged as individuals. They appeared as shadows, faceless collectives, the ever-convenient villains of decline. Their names surfaced only in Scandalway, Zhongxian in China, Narses in Byzantium, Kisler, Akka in the Ottoman quarterways, attached to suspicion, corruption, or intrigue. Their lives, consumed by service, ended in erasure. The irony was sharp. They were essential to empires, but absent from honor. They ran treasuries, guarded harems, delivered decrees, and sometimes even led armies. But when history told the story, it cast them as the problem, never the foundation. Power could not admit that it relied on mutilated boys, so the narrative turned them into scapegoats, useful in life, disposable in memory. No heirs carried their names forward. No family preserved their shrines. Wealth, if accumulated, returned to the palace. Even tombs, when they had them, rarely stood for long. The state reclaimed their estates. Their identities dissolved into bureaucracy. A eunuch could have served an emperor faithfully for decades, only to have his reputation erased with a stroke of a scribe's brush. Yet without them, dynasties would have faltered. The Forbidden City would not have functioned. The Byzantine court would not have spun its endless ceremonies. The Ottoman harem would not have remained sealed. Eunuchs were not side characters. They were the gears in the machinery of empire, the invisible scaffolding holding thrones upright. And still, history preferred to laugh at their voices, mock their bodies, and curse their influence. The scar that had guaranteed loyalty in life, guaranteed obscurity in death. Their bodies were taken, their roles defined, their legacies forgotten. They were political tools fashioned by mutilation tools the palace used, then discarded, leaving only faint echoes in stone and rumor. That is the final irony. Men made indispensable precisely by being made incomplete, remembered not as people, but as cautionary tales carved into the margins of empire. In societies that thrived on order, categories mattered. Men were men, women were women, and every ritual, law, and custom leaned heavily on keeping that line sharp. Eunuchs broke that line. They existed as unsettling reminders that bodies could be altered, that gender could blur, that the neat binaries holding culture together weren't as fixed as everyone liked to pretend. In imperial China, Confucian ethics built the family into the foundation of the state. Fathers produced sons, sons honored ancestors, and the cycle turned like clockwork. Eunuchs had no place in that cycle. They were branches cut from the tree, unable to grow or continue the line. The absence of lineage wasn't just a personal loss, it was a cultural disturbance. Their bodies mocked the very order society claimed was natural. Byzantium faced the same disquiet. Eunuchs sang in choirs, held office, and stood at the emperor's side. Yet chroniclers described them as neither male nor female. The high voices, the softened features, the lack of heirs at all, left them hovering in a space that had no clear name. And nothing unsettles societies more than what can't be named. The Ottomans, too, leaned on their presence while recoiling from what they represented. Black eunuchs from Africa filled top copies in courts, their very bodies standing as symbols of trustworthiness in guarding the Sultan's harem. Yet outside those walls, their condition invited mockery and disdain. The same scar that certified their loyalty branded them as unnatural in the eyes of others. It was this ambiguity, this refusal of the body to fit cleanly into existing categories that made them both necessary and despised. They were indispensable servants precisely because they stood outside the normal order, yet that same position rendered them eerie, unsettling, and easy to fear. Laughter followed them not because they were funny, but because society needed a way to manage its discomfort. And the discomfort deepened in places where eunuchs carried not only scars, but secrets, private knowledge that made their ambiguous position even more threatening. The palace trusted eunuchs with what no one else could hold. Its secrets. They were the silent figures in the background, witnessing conversations not meant for chroniclers, listening to whispers that decided succession, observing rituals that blurred the line between bedroom and statecraft. And this, more than their altered bodies, made them frightening. They knew too much. In China's Forbidden City, eunuchs lived inside the emperor's household, moving through spaces that Confucian officials were barred from. They knew which concubines held favor, which officials slipped bribes, which gestures carried real weight behind the throne. Their knowledge was intimate, domestic, and therefore dangerous. Ministers might debate policy in the open court, but eunuchs heard what was said in the emperor's private chambers at night. Byzantium gave them similar access. Eunuchs guided ambassadors into the presence of the emperor, managed correspondence, and sometimes even slept within the walls of the imperial bedchamber. It was said they knew more about the emperor's moods than generals did about his armies. Secrets clung to them like incense smoke, too heavy to escape, too potent to ignore. The Ottomans placed black eunuchs at the center of their greatest secret, the harem. They not only guarded the women but also managed the delicate politics of succession woven through those chambers. Which prince visited which mother, which concubine's child might rise to power. Such knowledge was lethal if spoken aloud. A eunuch carried it all in silence, a walking archive of truths too volatile for parchment. This made them terrifying to those outside the palace's inner circle. Eunuchs couldn't be dismissed as servants when they held the information that could ruin reputations, topple careers, or shift dynastic balance. And because they had no heirs, their loyalty couldn't be bargained with. Their tongues, if loosened, could bring down entire factions. But secrecy is a double-edged tool. Those who know too much can never be allowed to seem too powerful, which is why societies found ways to laugh at them, to shrink their power into ridicule, to ritualize their presence in ceremonies that made them look absurd even as they stood at the heart of imperial confidence. Ceremony, in most courts, was meant to awe. Thrones raised high, trumpets blaring, robes heavy with meaning. But within this theater, eunuchs often played roles that highlighted their difference, sometimes to the point of parody. Their very visibility invited ridicule, even as their duties were indispensable. In Ming China, eunuchs became the stage managers of ritual. They carried imperial regalia, announced decrees, and moved props in ceremonies that could last hours. Yet chroniclers never failed to note the oddness of their voices, the strangeness of their figures, the way their presence interrupted the ideal image of masculine authority. Court satire often exaggerated these traits, turning the eunuch from functionary into comic relief. Byzantine pageantry was no kinder. Eunuchs were prominent in processions, guiding imperial robes, holding sacred relics, and leading choirs. Their roles were essential, but their body stole thin, or oddly fleshy depending on when the knife was used, stood out against the soldiers and clerics who flanked them. Contemporary accounts often slipped from reverence into mockery, treating the eunuch's public visibility as an opportunity to underscore their ambiguous nature. In the Ottoman Empire, black eunuchs paraded at ceremonies marking royal births, marriages, or the circumcision of princes. They carried symbols of purity and trust, but their very role guarding a harem they could never touch became the butt of gossip among courtiers. While officials bowed to them in ritual, whispers behind their backs stripped away dignity, painting them as comic figures whose service seemed both powerful and absurd. Ritual thus worked two ways. It elevated eunuchs, making them highly visible, indispensable figures in the machinery of ceremony, but it also exposed them to scorn, transforming their uniqueness into an object of laughter. Public performance made them symbols, and symbols are easier to mock than people. Yet beneath the laughter, unease remained. For all the jokes and satire, eunuchs stood closer to the heart of power than most nobles ever could, and envy disguised as humor soon curdled into fear of their proximity to rulers, and to the secrets that proximity revealed. What unsettled nobles most wasn't what eunuchs lacked, but how close they stood. In the geography of power, distance mattered. Generals commanded armies but slept far from the throne. Ministers debated policies but waited outside the emperor's private quarters. Eunuchs, meanwhile, were inside lighting lamps in the harem, carrying robes into bedchambers, whispering orders as if they'd sprung from the ruler's lips. In China's Forbidden City, eunuchs weren't just servants. They lived where ministers were forbidden to tread. They saw which concubine had the emperor's ear, which advisor lingered too long at a private audience, which gesture betrayed a faltering mood. That kind of access was intoxicating to watch from afar. No general could hope to stand so near without armor, no official without ceremony. Byzantine eunuchs occupied similar ground. They stood at the emperor's shoulder during audiences, controlled who approached, and sometimes even shared meals in the intimate confines of the palace. Proximity gave them a kind of power that had nothing to do with titles. They didn't need to command armies. They could command attention with a whisper, because they alone had the ruler's trust. For the Ottomans, the threat of proximity was clearest in the harem. Black eunuchs controlled the movements of concubines and princes, guarded doorways no vizier could cross, and became mediators between women of the dynasty and the sultan himself. To outsiders, this wasn't service, it was influence. An influence without lineage or land looked suspiciously like manipulation. Mockery, then, was a safety valve. Nobles and officials laughed at eunuchs' voices, their bodies, their strangeness, because humor dulled the sting of envy. If ridicule could reduce them to comic figures, it made their closeness less frightening. Yet behind the laughter lurked unease, because everyone knew that whispers heard behind curtains carried more weight than speeches shouted in the court. And whispers are dangerous precisely because they can't be traced, which is why, in every court, eunuchs eventually became the embodiment of treachery itself. Trust built on scars was never real trust. Eunuchs were close because they couldn't father heirs, but closeness also meant access, and access could always be turned. That tension birthed the image of the eunuch as the hidden traitor, the schemer in the shadows, the one who betrayed not with swords but with murmurs. In China, dynastic histories almost ritualized this suspicion. Whenever an emperor drifted from Confucian ideals, the blame fell on eunuchs. They had whispered lies, corrupted virtue, manipulated policy. The figure of the eunuch became shorthand for palestikain, if a palestikain of a mind that Confucian scholars, who wrote the histories, despised eunuchs as rivals. Treachery was a convenient costume to dress them in. Byzantine sources painted them much the same. A eunuch advising too freely was accused of conspiracy. One who handled imperial correspondence too carefully was branded a deceiver. Their role as intermediaries, carrying words from ruler to subject, made them easy to cast as manipulators. If a command displeased, perhaps it was the eunuch who had twisted it. They became the permanent suspects of imperial politics. The Ottomans layered race into this suspicion. Black eunuchs, imported through slavery, were accused of alien loyalties. Their control over the harem, their influence on succession, their Their very survival in a hostile court made them perpetual targets for charges of betrayal. And when sultans fell, eunuchs were among the first to be drowned, strangled, or exiled, punished, not for acts committed, but for the threat their presence symbolized. It wasn't betrayal itself that haunted people, it was the possibility of betrayal. Stretched across every whisper and every glance, the eunuch became a living reminder that power could shift silently, that influence could be exercised invisibly. Fear dressed itself in suspicion, suspicion hardened into paranoia, and paranoia demanded ridicule as a form of control. But ridicule was never just about politics. It bled into the body itself, mocking not only what eunuchs might do, but what they appeared to be, half men staged on the theater of gender, provoking uneasy laughter wherever they stood. Everywhere they went, eunuchs carried their difference in plain sight, or in plain sound. Their bodies and voices betrayed them long before politics did, and societies, uneasy with blurred lines, turned that unease into theater. They laughed, exaggerated, and mocked, staging eunuchs as living jokes in the drama of gender. In China, their high voices and altered physiques made them stand out in court rituals. Satirists seized on these traits, portraying eunuchs as shrill caricatures of greed and weakness. Confucian officials, priding themselves on masculine scholarship and family lineage, weaponized humor to reinforce what the eunuch lacked. Laughter became a moral judgment, a way of saying, this is what happens when the body strays from nature. Byzantium added its own twist. Eunuchs sang in choirs, their voices soaring higher than any soldier's shout. What was sacred in song became suspect in satire, with chroniclers mocking the same voices as unmanly, even monstrous. They were both celebrated for beauty and derided for effeminacy, occupying a stage where gender rules collapsed and ridicule filled the gap. The Ottomans, too, blurred admiration with mockery. Black eunuchs walked the palace corridors in flowing robes, their tall figures imposing, their voices distinct. Gossip transformed them into objects of nervous laughter, men trusted with royal women yet denied any claim to manhood. Their bodies became punchlines, whispered in the bazaar, jokes that eased the tension of their visible power. This wasn't comedy for entertainment alone. It was a cultural performance, a way of policing the boundaries of masculinity. Eunuchs were mocked as half-men, not because society found them amusing, but because society needed to keep the categories intact. If masculinity was built on lineage and virility, then eunuchs had to be ridiculed into the margins, cast as cautionary figures of what happens when the order is disrupted. Yet mockery is a mask for fear. The very traits that made eunuchs laughable also made them disturbing. They blurred lines that were supposed to be unshakable, and in that blur lay power. Power unsettled enough to turn jokes into legends of poison, sorcery, and corruption. When satire wasn't enough to contain them, eunuchs slipped into folklore, where laughter hardened into something darker. Stories turned them from servants into sorcerers, from officials into corruptors, from intermediaries into the very embodiment of decadence. They became more than men without heirs, they became omens of dynastic ruin. In China, dynastic histories cast eunuchs as villains whenever emperors lost control. If crops failed, if corruption spread, if armies faltered, the blame found its way to palace servants. Over time, this wasn't just political scapegoating, it became a cultural myth. Eunuchs were remembered not as individuals, but as a collective curse, a sign that the dynasty had strayed from moral order. Their names lived on as shorthand for decay. Byzantium wrapped them in suspicion of sorcery. Some chronicles accused eunuchs of using spells or potions to sway rulers, painting them as whisperers of poison, both literal and symbolic. Their ambiguous bodies lent themselves easily to tales of unnatural influence. To call someone a eunuch wasn't just to describe them, it was to accuse them of meddling in dark arts. The Ottomans, too, wove them into moral tales. Black eunuchs, who controlled the harem, became symbols in popular imagination of the dangers of foreign corruption and palace intrigue. Satirical poems described them as tricksters, guarding virtue on the outside while plotting corruption on the inside. It wasn't history so much as theater, but the stories stuck. Folklore magnified fear by disguising it as lesson. Eunuchs weren't just mocked for their voices or their bodies anymore. They were cast as omens, warnings, personifications of everything unstable in political life. Demonization gave societies a neat answer to complex problems. Why did dynasties fall? Look no further than the eunuch. But myths aren't only about the past. They linger in the present. And for eunuchs, demonization meant being remembered less as servants and more as monsters. The eternal outsiders who could never be trusted, yet could never be erased. And that was the paradox, because even as they were cast as villains, eunuchs were still needed, still present, still woven into the machinery of empire. They were outsiders, but outsiders who could never truly be escaped. Eunuchs were always treated as outsiders, but they were outsiders the palace could never do without. That contradiction gave rise to a peculiar form of fear, the dread of being ruled by someone everyone insisted did not belong. They stood at the margins of society, while simultaneously planted in its very center, a presence impossible to ignore. In China, officials railed against them in Confucian memorials, demanding their expulsion from politics. Yet emperors kept them, precisely because their lack of family ties made them reliable. The bureaucrats cursed them as intruders, but bowed when a eunuch entered carrying imperial orders, exclusion in theory, authority in practice. Byzantium staged the same paradox. Eunuchs couldn't marry, couldn't father dynasties, couldn't join the noble houses that defined imperial life. And yet, there they were commanding armies, overseeing treasuries, whispering into emperors' ears. They were outsiders by definition, but insiders by necessity, the contradiction sharpening suspicion at every turn. The Ottomans leaned into it with calculated pragmatism. Black eunuchs came from far outside the empire. Enslaved boys turned into imperial guardians. Their very foreignness was the point. No local loyalties, no rival clans, no bloodline to anchor them elsewhere. They were strangers in Istanbul, but strangers entrusted with the Sultan's most intimate chambers. An outsider placed precisely where trust was most fragile. This constant tension bred ridicule. People laughed at eunuchs not only for their voices or their appearance, but for the absurdity of their position. How could someone mocked as a half-man also hold the keys to the emperor's secrets? Mockery made the contradiction tolerable. It was easier to laugh at them than to admit that power depended on them. And yet, their outsider status wasn't invisible, it was inscribed in their very bodies. Every voice that cracked too high, every frame that grew oddly tall or soft with age, reminded society of their difference. And difference, when it cannot be escaped, turns into obsession. The body of the eunuch spoke before he ever opened his mouth. It announced itself in ways no robe could disguise, no ceremony could conceal. Voices rang high, brittle and unearthly in the echoing halls of palaces. Faces softened, beards refused to grow, limbs sometimes stretched unnaturally long. Every step carried the mark of absence, and every mark drew both ridicule and unease. In China, records noted how eunuchs often lived longer than ordinary men, sometimes reaching remarkable old age. Yet their longevity was paired with fragility, weak bones, hunched backs, and ailments that made them visibly distinct. Their survival into old age became uncanny, as if their altered bodies defied the natural order that governed everyone else. Longevity that unsettled as much as it impressed. Byzantine observers were quick to notice the same. Chroniclers dwelled on voices nasal, shrill, unlike those of soldiers or priests. The sound itself became an object of mockery, a kind of living parody that trailed behind them. Even in religious choirs, where their voices soared beautifully, suspicion followed. Beauty and unease tangled in every note. The Ottomans saw difference in skin as well as sound. Black eunuchs, brought from distant regions, stood out doubly, by race and by mutilation. Their presence was both striking and disconcerting, the body itself a reminder of empire's reach and cruelty. To laugh at them was to cope with the unease their bodies stirred. The echo of the body meant that eunuchs could never disappear into anonymity. They were always marked, always recognizable, always summoned as symbols. Mockery attached itself to these visible traits, but fear hid just beneath it. Because their altered bodies didn't just look different, they proved that power could be carved into flesh. And flesh that carried such visible reminders rarely disappeared from cultural memory. Long after their courts fell, eunuchs lingered in stories, half feared, half ridiculed, remembered less as individuals than as unsettling figures whose existence had to be explained away. When the palaces emptied and the dynasties collapsed, eunuchs didn't simply vanish. They lingered in memory, though never kindly. Chroniclers, playwrights and moralists carried their image forward, etched not in marble but in ridicule and suspicion. What they had done for empires was overshadowed by what they were believed to represent. In Chinese histories, eunuchs became the ready-made villains of dynastic decline. Whenever emperors faltered, it was the eunuchs who corrupted them, the eunuchs who siphoned wealth, the eunuchs who whispered ruin into the throne's ear. The blame was convenient, almost ritualistic, ensuring that their names lived on as curses rather than achievements. Byzantium's legacy was theatrical. Satirical plays and biting chronicles cast eunuchs as conniving courtiers, half men drunk on influence, their voices imitated on stage to provoke laughter. What had once been servants became stock characters, recycled caricatures of treachery and absurdity. In Ottoman memory, eunuchs were remembered as shadows of the harem, exoticized in European travel accounts and reduced to symbols of decadence and despotism. Their actual lives, the service, the discipline, the proximity to power, were erased beneath layers of mockery and fear. What tied these legacies together was the duality. Eunuchs were always feared for what they might do and mocked for what they could never be. Fear without mockery would have admitted too much power. Mockery without fear would have dismissed them as irrelevant. The combination ensured they remained unsettling long after their courts had ended. So the eunuch endured in memory, not as an individual but as a symbol, a body altered by politics, ridiculed for its difference, feared for its closeness to power. History remembered them with a sneer, a whisper, and a nervous laugh, leaving behind a legacy where suspicion and mockery walked hand in hand.